Plan on flying? It's time to upgrade to a Real ID. Because starting May 7th, 2025, to board domestic flights, your driver's license or state-issued ID must be a Real ID. Or you'll need another acceptable form of identification. So don't wait. Find out how to get your Real ID at tsa.gov/Real ID. That's tsa.gov/Real ID. Or visit your local DMV. And then you'll be cleared for takeoff.
Welcome to Everything with Everett. This is a talk show podcast hosted by Everett McConaughey. The purpose of this production is to share thoughts, voices, and information to further a discussion on who we are as individuals, communities, and a global society. Everything with Everett is open to all topics of discussion: faith, science, history, finances, social issues, and, well, everything. Be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Visit everettpodcast.com for all the details.
Have you ever thought about how much money is in $1 million or $1 billion? With the current economic era that we live in, starting since 2007, prices have definitely skyrocketed, and some people definitely have a lot more money at the end of the day, year, or lifetime than the rest. And so I wanted to do an episode about minimum wage and kind of help aggregate the difference of these wages, just to kind of make it a little bit more manageable, because it was mentioned to me, it was like, oh, if you won the lottery, won a couple $1 million, would you keep working? And I was like, yeah, probably. And they're like, why? You wouldn't need to. And I was like, well, obviously I would probably do it because I like to keep my mind active and whatnot, but maybe at a part-time level, or I'd be more like, oh, whatever, don't need this job, literally. But I think it's really hard for us to grasp just how much $1 million is. And then when you go to the next level and think about $1 billion, like, nobody should have $1 billion. Especially when you think about that in the average lifetime, you're maybe going to make like a couple million. Like, there's no way, even if you're doing really, really well at a lower hourly rate, like, there's no way you need $1 billion in your lifetime to live a good life. Like, we shouldn't have billionaires. Anyway, so I wanted to first start off with the history of minimum wage. And so I'm using two sites, both .gov websites, so they are credible. The first one just describes what minimum wage is, and then the next one talks about the history of changes to the minimum wage law. It's a little bit longer, and then if you want to skip forward to the third half or the third portion, I have a spreadsheet that I built for myself. I will link to it in the podcast description notes if you want to check it out yourself. It will be set to just be viewable only, but not changeable, because, we don't want someone to screw it up. But I will link to a spreadsheet that actually breaks down an hourly wage of $7.25, which is the federal minimum, versus somebody who takes home $1 million a year or takes home $1 billion per year, how much that wage per hour is, how much the overtime rate is, and then tells you how many lifetimes or how many different workers each level could fund. So, interesting stuff. Hopefully you enjoy this episode. Let me know. Send me a message, text, whatever. Connect on the socials. But I don't mind talking to ether. So here we are. Minimum wage. So this is from usa.gov/minimum-wage. Minimum wage, the Fair Labor Standards Act, gives you the right to minimum wage. The Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division enforces these rights. What is minimum wage? Minimum wage is the lowest hourly wage an employer can legally pay an employee. Congress made minimum wage a law under the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, enforced by the U.S. Department of Labor. FLSA, establishes the federal minimum wage for employees who work at private companies and in federal, state, and local governments. There's a link if you want to get more answers to frequently asked questions about minimum wage on this page, so definitely recommend checking it out. Federal minimum wage. The federal minimum wage is $7.25 per hour. This rate applies to covered non-exempt workers. The minimum wage for employees who receive tips is $2.13 per hour. The amount of tips plus the $2.13 per hour must reach at least $7.25 per hour. If not, your employer must pay to make up the difference. And lastly, on this page, state minimum wages. Some states and cities set their own minimum wage rates. If the federal and local government minimum wage is different, the higher wage rate applies. And there's a link, check minimum wage rates in your state. And then lastly, it says your state may also have different minimum wages for employees who receive tips. Another link for that. That information was updated April 1st, 2025. Again, the link to that is usa.gov/minimum-wage. And then the next article that I wanted to go over, this one's a little bit longer. It comes from departmentoflabor.gov, DOL.gov/agencies/WHD/minimum-wage/history. Again, links to all these sites will be in the description, show notes. Take a look there wherever you are listening to your podcast. My website, Apple Podcasts, Spotify Podcasts, Amazon Music, anywhere. History of changes to the minimum wage law. This was adapted from the minimum wage and maximum hours standards under the Fair Labor Standards Act 1988 report to Congress under Section 4D1 of the FLSA. Early in the administration of the FLSA, Fair Labor Standards, whatever it was, anyway. Yeah, Fair Labor Standards Act. It became apparent that the application of the statutory minimum wage was likely to produce undesirable effects upon the economies of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, if applied to all of their covered industries. Consequently, on June 26, 1940, an amendment was enacted prescribing the establishment of special industry committees to determine and issue, through wage orders, the minimum wage levels applicable to Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. The rates established by industry committees could be less than the statutory rates applicable elsewhere in the United States. On May 14, 1947, the FLSA was amended by the Portal to Portal Act. This legislation was significant because it resolved some issues as to what constitutes compensation hours worked under FLSA. Matters involving underground travel in coal mines and make-ready practices in factories had been decided earlier in a number of U.S. Supreme Court decisions. Subsequent amendments to the FLSA have extended the law's coverage to additional employees and raised the level of minimum wage. In 1949, the minimum wage was raised from 40 cents an hour to 75 cents an hour. For all workers, and minimum wage coverage was expanded to include workers in the air transportation industry. The 1949 amendments also eliminated industry committees except in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. A specific section was added granting the wage and hour administrator in the U.S. Department of Labor authorization to control the incidence of exploitative industrial homework. A 1955 amendment increased the minimum wage to $1 an hour with no changes in coverage. The 1961 amendments greatly expanded FLSA's scope in the retail trade sector and increased the minimum for previously covered workers to $1.15 an hour, effective September 1961, and to $1.25 an hour in September 1963. The minimum for workers newly subject to the Act was set to $1 an hour, effective September 1961, $1.15 an hour, September 1964, and $1.25 an hour, September 1965. Retail and service establishments were allowed to employ full-time students at wages of no more than 15% below the minimum with proper certification from the Department of Labor. The amendments extended coverage to employees of retail trade enterprises with sales exceeding $1 million annually. I'm sure back in the 60s, a company making $1 million was like, whoa, that's huge. Trinkets in the days of this Amazon world. Exceeding $1 million annually. Although individual establishments within the covered enterprise were exempt if their annual sales fell below $250,000. The concept of enterprise coverage was introduced by the 1961 amendments. Those amendments extended coverage to retail and trade industry from an established 250,000 workers to 2.2 million. Congress further broadened the coverage with amendments in 1966 by lowering the enterprise sales volume test to $500,000, effective February 1967, with a further cut down to $250,000, effective February 1969. In 1966, also extended coverage to public schools, nursing homes, laundries, and the entire construction industry. Farms were subject to coverage for the first time if their employment reached 500 or more man-days of labor in the previous year's peak quarter. The minimum wage went to $1 an hour effective February 1967 for newly covered non-farm workers, $1.15 an hour in February 1968, $1.30 an hour in February 1969, and $1.45 an hour in February 1970. Continuing, it went up to $1.60 an hour in February 1971. Increases for newly subject farm workers stopped at $1.30 an hour. The 1966 amendments extended the full-time student certification program to covered agricultural employers and to its institutions of higher learning. In 1974, Congress included under the FLSA all no supervisory employees of federal, state, and local governments and many domestic workers. Subsequently, in 1976, the National League of Cities versus Usury, the Supreme Court held that the minimum wage and overtime provisions of the FLSA could not constitutionally apply to state and local government employees engaged in traditional government functions. The minimum wage increased to $2 an hour in 1974, $2.10 in 1975, and $2.30 in 1976 for all exempt farm workers, whose minimum initially rose to $1.60. Parity with non-farm workers was reached at $2.30 with the 1977 amendments. The 1977 amendments, by eliminating the separate lower minimum for large agricultural employers, although retaining the overtime exemption, set a new uniform wage schedule for all covered workers. The minimum wage went to $2.65 an hour in January 1978, $2.90 in January 1979, and $3.10 in January 1980. And again, $3.35 January 1981. The amendments eased provisions for establishments permitted to employ students at the lower wage rate and allowed special waivers for children 10 to 11 years old to work in agriculture. The overtime exemption for employees in hotels, motels, and restaurants was eliminated. To allow for the effects of inflation, the $250,000 exemption for employees in hotels, motels, restaurants... Hang on. I jumped a line. To allow for the effects of inflation, the $250,000 volume of sales coverage test for retail, trade, and service enterprises was increased in stages to $362,500 after December 31st, 1981. As a result of the Supreme Court's 1985 decision in Garcia versus San Antonio's Metropolitan Transit Authority et al., Congress passed amendments changing the application of FLSA to the public sector employees. Specifically, these amendments permit state and local governments to compensate their employees for overtime hours covered with compensatory time off in lieu of overtime pay at a rate of 1.5 hours for each hour of overtime worked. In 1989, amendments established a single annual dollar volume test of $500,000 for enterprise coverage of both retail and non-retail businesses. At the same time, the amendments eliminated the minimum wage and overtime exemption for small retail firms. Thus, employees of small retail businesses became subject to minimum wage and overtime pay in a work week in which they engage in commerce or the production of goods for commerce. The minimum wage was raised to $3.80 an hour beginning April 1st, 1990, and to $4.25 an hour beginning April 1st, 1991. The amendments also established a training wage provision at 85% of minimum wage, but not less than $3.35 an hour for employees under the age of 20. A provision that expired in 1993. Finally, the amendments established an overtime exception for time spent by employees in remedial education and civil money penalties for willful or repeated violations of the minimum wage or overtime pay requirements of the law. In 1990, Congress enacted legislation requiring regulations to be issued providing the special overtime exemption of certain highly skilled professionals in the computer field who receive not less than 6 1/2 times the applicable minimum wage. Overtime exemption, certain highly skilled professionals in the computer field who receive not less than 6. Oh, look, a minimum wage. Interesting. Universal basic income. What a concept. The 1996 amendments increased the minimum wage to $4.75 an hour on October 1st, 1996, and to $5.15 an hour September 1st, 1997. The amendments also established a youth sub-minimum wage of $4.25 an hour for newly hired employees under age 20 during the first 90 days of consecutive calendar days after being hired by their employer. Revised the tip credit provisions to allow employers to pay qualifying tipped employees no less than $2.13 per hour if they receive the remainder of their statutory minimum wage in tips. Set the hourly compensation test for qualifying computer-related professional employees at $27.63 an hour, and amended the Portal to Portal Act to allow employers and employees to agree on the use of employer-provided vehicles for commuting to and from work at the beginning and end of the workday, without continuing the commuting time as compensable work time if certain conditions were met. The 2007 amendment increased the minimum wage to $5.85 per hour effective July 24, 2007, $6.55 per hour effective July 24, 2008, and $7.25 per hour effective July 24, 2009. A separate provision of the bill brings about phased increases to minimum wage in the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands and the American Samoa, with the goal of bringing the minimum wages in those locations up to the general federal minimum wage over a number of years. Anywho, so there's tons of information, but basically it's been this kind of like catch-up game since the 1940s, and about every 10 years they do something about it, but apparently the last time we had an actual functional Congress was in 2007, so reach out to your representatives, state and federal, and ask them what the hell they've been doing since 2007. just for the heck of it, I decided to look up the inflated value of $7.25 from July 2007, what it would be equivalent to today. So $7.25 in July 2007 has the same buying power as $11.17 in April 2025. Like, what the heck? Fun fact for you guys, I had a job. I did security for the state of Idaho. I was on call 24/7. They could call me anytime, day or night, 7 days a week. I was never guaranteed time off. I made $11 an hour to be on call. And I literally would have times where I would go secure, one state government office building complex, whatever, and then be in the parking lot heading home to go have dinner. Again, after being called into work and not having time to bring food with me or anything. And then they'd say, we need you to come work down at the Capitol building for 4 more hours. So I'd have impromptu 12-hour days, my poor dog, and no food with me. It was exciting times, I'll tell you that. And everybody else had guaranteed weekends or whatever. They had their 2 days off. They made 75 cents less per hour than I did. What the hell was I thinking? I was young, desperate for money. I paid my bills. So, good times. So I will link to those articles for you, the history of the change in minimum wage, all that jazz. Now, on to the meat of what I did last weekend. I was going to do this podcast about a week ago, but this spreadsheet took so much time that by the time I was done with it and building out all the different layers I wanted to be able to touch on, I was frankly kind of exhausted. And I was like, you know what? We're going to wait. We're going to let it sit and marinate in my head. And so now, without further ado, here we go. So minimum wage, as we went over, is $7.25 an hour. Set in 2007, became final at that level in February, I believe, 2009. So we're many, many years in this path. So if somebody makes $7.25 an hour and works 40 hours a week, they will make $290 a week. If they do overtime, their overtime wage at 1.5 the minimum wage rate is $10.88. So if somebody does 20 hours of overtime, that would be an additional $217.50 for a combined total of, for a 60-hour work week at minimum wage, $507.50 per week. So then, per year, if you factor that out, if you did a 60-hour work week, total, let's see. Oh, okay. The overtime total. Okay. So if you just did, 1 year of 40 hours a week, $7.25 an hour, no overtime, anything like that, you would earn $15,080. What are you going to, you can't even buy a car for that these days. So that's how much you would make just straight 40 hours. If you did all the overtime every week, that would add an additional $11,310 to your paychecks. So if you did 60-hour work weeks at the minimum wage, $7.25 an hour plus the overtime rate, $10.88 per hour, total of 60 hours, you could at most bring home or make, this is before taxes, obviously, $26,390. You might be able to buy a vehicle at that point, but that's it. There's no rent. There's no food. There's no life outside of that car. No gas, nothing. All credit card. Like that from Home Alone. Credit card, you got it. Welcome to America. If you also looked at housing standards, a lot of rentals want you to make 3 times the rent rate. So someone who's making minimum wage, if they just work their base hours, they need just 40 hours a week at minimum wage. 1/3 of their annual income, they could at most afford rent at $418.89. If they spend more than $377 on housing, they are spending more than 30% of their income on housing. And technically, from what I've heard, that means that you are in poverty in this country if you spend more than 30% of your income on housing. Which, apparently housing is a profitable gig these days for the investment firms. Now, if you look at someone who makes minimum wage plus does the overtime, again, 60-hour weeks for 52 weeks in 1 year, they'll make $26,390. 1/3 of that income is $733.06. And 30% of their income with that total, again, 60-hour works week, not much time to enjoy the house. 30% of their income, their rent would need to be at or below $659.75. You can't rent crap for those prices anywhere, even in the most podunk of deserty, isolated, trash locations in the middle of this country. So then if you move on to the millionaire wage, hang on, let's pause on the millionaire wage. And so I thought about a living wage. What if we just elevated it enough to where by many standards you could actually survive? What would that look like? Well, the current minimum wage for the state of Pennsylvania and in many, cities is $23 an hour. That's pretty sizable. In most places you're not going to be rich by any means, but you can at least do a lot more than $7.25 an hour. So a living base wage of $23 an hour for 40 hours in 1 week would give you $920 a week or an annual pay of $47,840. Significantly better, I might add, than the $15,080 of minimum wage. Massively better. 3 times better. An overtime wage for someone making $23 an hour is $34.50. They could add, if they work 20 hours of overtime a week, they could add $690 to that paycheck. So in total, if you make $23 an hour plus the 1.5 time overtime rate and did a 60-hour work week, you could make $1,610 per week, again, before taxes. So the base rate with $23 an hour, just doing 40 hours a week, you could make $47,840. If you add in 20 hours of overtime every week for the whole year, 52 weeks, you can add an additional $35,880 for a grand total. If you work 60 hours a week for 52 weeks at $23 an hour plus the 1.5 time overtime wage, you could make a total before taxes of $83,720. Massively better than the same scenario of only bringing in $26,390 for the same amount of work. If you then look at housing costs, the base rate for 1 year at $23 an hour, if they don't do any overtime, 1/3 the housing cost would be a monthly rent of $1,328.89, much closer to what is actually out there. And 30% of their income going to housing would be at or below $1,196. If they do a year of overtime, make close to that 83,000 benchmark, 1/3 of their housing cost would be $2,325.56 a month. And 30% of their housing cost would need to be below or at $2,093. So a millionaire makes a massive amount of money. So I factored this all into equaling $1 million at the end of the year base rate. and then adjusted the money from there. So if you start out as $1 million base, a salaried person, they wouldn't really have an hourly rate because they're just making $1 million. But if, for consistency's sake, if we were like, oh, you make $1 million, but you're hourly, you still have to clock in. If we break it down in the same ways, someone who's bringing home $1 million base salary is going to make $480.70 per hour. That's complete crap. Then if they make overtime, in addition to their base salary of $1 million, their overtime rate would be $721.15 per hour. Even Elon Musk isn't worth that. Any of those wages per hour. He literally sits there and tells companies and advertisers to F off. Like, what the hell, you know? So a millionaire making $480.70 per hour, like, what are they doing? At that wage, you'd be doing everything in the company, I hope. Definitely not just sitting in a desk in the corner of the building. Think of how many more employees you could fund with that wage. Like, talk about bloat. Anyway, so if you make a base salary of $1 million and your hourly rate is $480.77, you also work 20 hours of overtime, you could, hang on. Dang. You could take home a total of $33,653.85 per week. Per week. That's insane. A millionaire can literally make as much in 1 week as many people make in a whole year of their life. Already right there, I hope you agree. We do not need billionaires. I wonder what that looks like. Hint, hint, hint. Add another bunch of decimal places at the end of it. See where this is going. So if someone was an hourly employee with a base salary of $1 million and they did 20 hours of overtime, so 60 hours a week with their overtime rate, they could end up making, before taxes, $1,750,000. Housing at 1/3 of their base salary would be $27,777.78 per month. And 30% of their housing would be $25,000 per month. If they did the overtime and made $1,750,000, almost $2 million, their 1/3 housing cost would be $48,611.11, and 30% of their housing expenses would need to be at or below $43,750. WTF. Why did I copy all that? Living wage. Interesting. Okay. Then jumping down to the billionaire wage. So your base salary is $1 billion. Your hourly base rate for a billionaire. This is Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, all those people. And you just times this by however many billion they're making. For $1 billion, an hourly rate of $480,000, $769.23. An overtime rate of $721,153.85 per hour. Each month, let me see what that one was. B3, what was B3? B3, oh yeah, hours. So in 1 week, a billionaire would make $19,230,769.23. Overtime. This is ridiculous. I'm not even going to read it because who the hell is making overtime as a billionaire? Like this is ludicrous. Nobody should be making $1 billion. But 1 year base salary of $1 billion, 1/3 of their housing, they could be approved for a rental that is right around, let's see, that's 100,000, $27,777,777.78. 30% of their housing expenses would need to be at or below $25 million. Just pennies for the rich people. Donald Trump and the Musk and Bezos. If they did overtime, with their overtime rate, they could work, 60 hours. I hope for $1 billion, they better be living in that office, chained to the desk, literally giving their blood at the same time. If you work 60 hours with the classic hourly wage plus overtime rate, base salary of $1 million plus the overtime of $750 million, they could potentially make $1,750,000,000. 1/3 of that for housing would allow them to get a rental or a mortgage of $48,611,111.11. And 30% of their housing would need to be at or below $43,750,000. So if you look at the totals, a minimum wage worker, if you worked minimum wage for 40, and this is just the base, no overtime, nothing like that. If you work from age 18 to 65, those are kind of the general adult years of working. 65 is the standard retirement age. 47 years, just minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, where it has been sitting since 2009. It is now 2025. Everybody that you've ever elected to office hasn't done crap about this since 2009. They don't think you need to make more than $7.25 an hour. You need to contact your congressman right now. But if you make minimum wage, federal minimum wage, and your state hasn't done anything else besides that, bare minimum for 47 years, you'll make $15,080 a year. Your lifetime total at that wage for 47 years will be $708,760. Again, that's before any bills, anything you choose to purchase, any costs of being alive. In that same amount of time, a millionaire working 1 year can fund the lifetime income of 1.4 minimum wage workers. A billionaire in 1 year, $1 billion can fund the 47-year lifetime minimum wage income of 1,410.9 individuals. Literally, delete one employee and you can create jobs for the masses. That's trickle down, folks. Now, if we look at a living wage, $23 an hour, like I went over earlier, again, working 47 years, 18 to 65, you're going to obviously have some increases over time in that threshold. But if we look at just living wage, $23 an hour, no changes, no overtime, nothing special, you're going to make $47,840 per year. Again, that's before any costs of living that you incur. The lifetime total at $23 an hour, if you had no changes and made that from the beginning to the end, would be $2,248,480. Why does this seem... Hang on. Something seems screwy with this. I might have messed up something on the millionaire thing with the minimum wage. I'm going to need to figure that one out in a second. Divided by that, D16, divided by L. And that one was D6 millionaire divided by, where's L6? L6. There we go. Nope, down there. Let's change this. Divided by that. Number's still the same. Interesting. Okay. That's something's screwed up here. So, living wage, 47 years, $47,840. Lifetime total, $2,248,000. And I'm going to skip, obviously, a millionaire in 1 year, they could afford half of essentially a lifetime of a living wage person. A billionaire, on the other hand, can afford the lifetime wage of a living person, of a living wage individual, 444.7 individuals could be paid for by one billionaire's salary. Now, a millionaire wage, if you made that for 47 years, 18 to 65, you would make $46,999,999.92. A billionaire's 1 year salary could pay for 21.28 millionaires. So literally, if for every billionaire we delete, we could have at least 21 to 1,500 people funded with some kind of money. Why does one person need the income equivalent of 1,410 employees? Federally recognized minimum wage employees. WTF. Tax the rich. 10% for you, 10% for me. Seems pretty fair. And maybe that'll make America great again.
Thank you for listening to Everything with Everett. Connect with Everett and other listeners on Facebook and Twitter at Everett Podcast. Everett would love to hear from you. Share your thoughts by emailing mystory@everettpodcast.com. You can also leave a voicemail or send a text message to 208-391-2808. Choose to listen, speak with kindness, and have a great day.